Welcome to The Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we're going to explore the story of Spartacus, a man who began as property, became a legend, and somehow managed to terrify Rome so thoroughly that they crucified 6,000 people just to make sure everyone understood that slave rebellions were a poor career choice. The story begins not with Spartacus, but with Rome itself, because understanding the man who nearly brought the Republic to its knees requires understanding the society that created him, used him, and ultimately defined itself against him. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had become something unprecedented in human history, a republic that functioned like an empire, a city-state that controlled the Mediterranean world, a society built on principles of citizenship and law that somehow required millions of human beings to be treated as livestock. The contradiction wasn't lost on everyone, but it was conveniently ignored by most, particularly by those who profited from it. The Roman Republic in 73 BCE was a place of extraordinary wealth and equally extraordinary cruelty. The great families lived in marble villas, discussed philosophy in Greek, and competed to stage increasingly elaborate public entertainments. Their wealth came from conquest. Rome had spent the previous 2 centuries systematically conquering the Mediterranean world, defeating Carthage, absorbing Greece, subduing Spain, annexing great swaths of Asia Minor and North Africa. And with conquest came slaves, hundreds of thousands of them, perhaps millions. The exact numbers are lost to history, but the scale was staggering. Every military campaign sent floods of captives to Rome's markets. Every conquered city contributed its population to Roman servitude. Slavery was not merely an institution in Rome, it was the foundation upon which the entire economy rested. These were not the chattel slaves of later eras, defined by race and born into hereditary bondage. Roman slavery was more democratic in its brutality. Anyone could become a slave. Conquest was the primary source. You fought against Rome, Rome won, you became property. Piracy was another major supplier. The Mediterranean was full of slavers who raided coastal villages and captured ships, selling their human cargo to eager Roman buyers. Debt, crime, even simply being born to slave parents, all were pathways into bondage. The treatment of slaves varied enormously depending on their role and owner. Educated Greek slaves might serve as tutors, physicians, or secretaries, living in relative comfort within wealthy households. Skilled craftsmen could be valuable property, treated with some care to preserve their productivity. Domestic servants in kind households might experience tolerable lives, at least by the standards of the era. But for others, for the vast majority who worked in agriculture, in mines, in construction, slavery meant brutality, exhaustion, and early death. These slaves were economic units, investments to be used until they broke. Their lives were measured in productivity. Their deaths were accounting losses, and their suffering was simply the cost of doing business. And then there were the gladiators. The gladiatorial games had evolved from funeral rites into mass entertainment, from solemn observances of death into spectacles of death, from ritual to industry. By Spartacus's time, the games were enormous business. Lanistae, gladiator trainers and owners, purchased slaves with combat potential, trained them to kill efficiently and die dramatically, and rented them out for public games. The gladiators lived in barracks called ludi, prison-like facilities where they were fed, trained, and kept under constant guard. The life of a gladiator was a peculiar kind of hell. They were slaves, certainly, property that could be bought and sold. But they were also celebrities of a sort, famous within their world, admired for their skill and courage, even as they were despised for their status. They lived with the constant knowledge that every time they entered the arena, they might not leave it. The training was brutal, designed to create efficient killers. The fights were real. This was not performance combat, but actual violence, actual death, staged for the entertainment of citizens who cheered or jeered, depending on the quality of the dying. Into this world came a man from Thrace. Thrace was wild country, mountains that scraped the sky, forests where wolves still ruled, rivers that ran cold from peaks that never fully shed their snow. It lay north and east of Macedonia, beyond the regions where Greek culture had fully taken root, a land of tribes rather than cities, of warriors who painted themselves for battle and worshipped gods Rome had never heard of. The Thracians had a reputation that preceded them across the ancient world. They were horsemen, skilled with the cavalry tactics that made them valuable as mercenaries and terrifying as enemies. They fought with a particular style, fast, aggressive, using a curved sword called a sika that could hook behind shields and find flesh. They wore tattoos that marked clan and achievement, decorations that Romans found barbaric and fascinating in equal measure. The Roman grip on Thrace was tentative at best. Treaties existed, alliances were claimed, but the reality was more complicated. Thracian tribes would acknowledge Roman authority when it suited them and ignore it when it didn't. Roman governors posted to the region learned quickly that managing Thracians required a delicate balance between intimidation and negotiation, that pushing too hard could spark rebellion, and that rebellion in these mountains was costly to suppress. Somewhere in this landscape, in the early decades of the 1st century BCE, a boy was born who would one day be called Spartacus. We know nothing certain about his childhood. The ancient historians who wrote about him were Romans, writing decades or centuries after his death, and they cared little for the early life of a slave who rebelled. But we can sketch the outlines of possibility, paint the landscape in which he must have grown. He would have been raised in a warrior culture, where boys learned to ride almost before they could walk, where combat training began in childhood, where strength and courage were the measures of a man's worth. The Thracian tribes lived by herding and raiding, by alliance and warfare, by codes of honor that were ancient when Rome was still a collection of huts on 7 hills. He would have heard stories, every culture has them, of great warriors and cunning victories, of gods who walked among men and heroes who became legends. The Thracian gods were not the sanitized deities of Greek mythology or the state-sponsored gods of Rome. They were fierce, demanding, interested in blood and courage, gods who respected warriors and had little patience for cowards. He would have learned his people's way of war, not the disciplined formations of Roman legions, but the fluid, aggressive tactics of tribal warfare. How to use terrain, how to strike and fade, how to turn apparent retreat into ambush, how to fight from horseback, using the mobility of cavalry to offset superior numbers, how to make every warrior count, because Thracian tribes could not afford to waste fighters in the kind of mass battles Rome specialized in. And he would have learned, as every Thracian learned, that Rome was both opportunity and threat. Rome hired Thracian warriors as auxiliaries, paying good wages for military service. But Rome also conquered, gradually extending its influence, making treaties that slowly became chains, turning independent peoples into subjects. The choice facing many young Thracian men was stark. Serve Rome as a soldier, resist Rome as an enemy, or try to avoid Rome entirely and hope the empire's attention fell elsewhere. Spartacus, though he would not yet have been known by that name, which was likely a Roman designation given in captivity, made a choice that would determine everything that followed. He became a soldier. The sources hint at this but provide no details. One ancient historian suggests he served in the Roman army as an auxiliary, that he wore Rome's uniform and fought Rome's wars. Another implies he fought against Rome, was captured in battle, and was enslaved as punishment. The truth might be both, or neither, or some combination we cannot reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. What we can reasonably infer is that Spartacus received military training that went beyond tribal warfare. He understood Roman tactics, Roman discipline, Roman military organization. Whether he learned this as an auxiliary soldier in Roman service or as an enemy who studied his opponents carefully, the result was the same. He became intimately familiar with how Rome made war. Somewhere in this period, we cannot date it precisely, everything went wrong. Perhaps he deserted from Roman service. The sources suggest this possibility, that he served Rome, grew disillusioned, or saw opportunity elsewhere, and fled his unit. Desertion from the Roman military was a capital offense, but if caught, a man might be enslaved rather than executed, particularly if he had valuable skills. A Thracian warrior who knew Roman tactics would be valuable as a gladiator. Or perhaps he was captured in warfare. Thrace was never fully pacified, and conflicts erupted regularly between Roman forces and Thracian tribes. A warrior captured in battle might be enslaved as a matter of course, his skill with weapons marking him as suitable for gladiatorial training. Or perhaps it was simpler and more brutal. Pirates took him. The Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts were infested with slavers who raided villages and captured travelers. A young Thracian man, strong and healthy, would bring a good price at market. His military bearing would mark him as gladiator material, and slavers knew that gladiators commanded premium prices. However it happened, Spartacus became property. His freedom was erased, his identity reduced to commercial value, his future determined by the man who purchased him. He was shackled, transported, sold in a market where human beings were evaluated like livestock, teeth checked, muscles examined, health assessed. And he was brought to Capua. Capua was a wealthy city south of Rome, famous for its gladiatorial schools. The ludus of Lentulus Batiatus was one of the largest, housing perhaps 200 gladiators at any time. It was a business, pure and simple. Batiatus purchased slaves with combat potential, trained them to fight and die entertainingly, and rented them out for games throughout the region. Some gladiators were prisoners of war, others condemned criminals, others simply slaves whose owners thought they might be profitable in the arena. The building itself was designed to contain and control. Stone walls surrounded the compound, high enough to prevent escape, thick enough to prevent breach. Inside, the cells were small, dark, barely large enough for a man to lie down. Chains were standard issue, locked around ankles at night, to prevent any possibility of coordinated action. Guards patrolled constantly, alert for any sign of resistance or rebellion. Spartacus would have entered this place in chains, understanding immediately that his life had narrowed to a simple choice: fight and possibly survive, or refuse and certainly die. There was no third option, no appeals process, no path back to freedom except through the arena and the nearly impossible achievement of earning enough victories to purchase manumission. The training began immediately. The gladiatorial schools were ruthlessly efficient at turning raw material into profitable fighters. Every morning, the gladiators were driven to the training yard, an open space surrounded by high walls covered in sand that was raked daily to remove bloodstains from the previous day's training accidents. The training weapons were wood. No chance of slaves arming themselves with real swords. But wooden weapons could still break bones, still cause injury, still hurt enough to teach lessons about blocking and footwork. The doctors, the trainers, often former gladiators themselves, taught with violence and repetition. Learn the moves or suffer the consequences. Block properly or take the blow. Survive the training or wash out in ways that were rarely pleasant. There were different styles of gladiatorial combat, each with its own equipment and techniques. The Murmillo fought with a short sword and large rectangular shield, armored heavily, designed to be a stable, powerful fighter. The Thrace, the Thracian style, used a small rectangular shield and a curved sickle sword, fought with agility and speed, relied on mobility rather than armor. The Retiarius fought with net and trident, almost completely unarmored, depending on reach and the ability to entangle opponents. The Secutor was heavily armored, designed specifically to hunt the Retiarius. Spartacus was almost certainly trained as a Thrax. It was logical. He was Thracian. He already knew how to use the Sika, and the fighting style suited someone with his background. The Thracian gladiator was mobile, aggressive, deadly at close range, and spectacular to watch when properly matched against a heavier opponent. The training was not just physical. Gladiators had to learn to perform, to understand that they were not merely fighting, but entertaining. A quick, efficient kill might be tactically sound, but it disappointed the crowd. They wanted drama, near misses, reversals of fortune, displays of courage, and deaths that were meaningful rather than merely functional. A gladiator who won quickly and boringly would receive less applause than one who gave the crowd a show. And the crowd's reaction mattered. After a fight, if the loser was still alive, the editor of the games, the official hosting the event, would consult the crowd's wishes about whether the defeated gladiator should be killed or spared. Thumbs up or thumbs down. Though the actual gesture is debated, the crowd passed judgment. A gladiator who had fought well, who had entertained, who had shown courage even in defeat, might be spared. One who had been cowardly or boring might be condemned even if he fought skillfully. This dynamic created a complex psychological environment. Gladiators were slaves, forced to fight for the entertainment of free Romans. But within that oppression, there was a strange kind of agency. Fight well, entertain effectively, demonstrate courage, and you might survive. Build a following among the crowds, become popular, and you became valuable, and valuable gladiators were protected, better fed, given some small luxuries. Spartacus survived. More than survived. He thrived, in the only way thriving was possible in such a place. He won his fights, apparently repeatedly. We know this because he lived long enough to become notable, and gladiators who lost their early fights didn't live long. Every victory meant continuing to exist, continuing to have a future, however constrained and brutal. But survival in the arena came at a cost that was not merely physical. Every fight required Spartacus to kill or maim another human being, often another slave, someone forced into the arena just as he was, someone who wanted to live just as desperately. The psychological weight of that, of being forced to kill people who were not enemies but fellow victims, of having one's humanity reduced to the capacity for violence, that left scars that no physician could treat. The gladiators developed their own culture within the ludus, a society within the larger society that enslaved them. They shared meals, trained together, formed friendships and rivalries. They had a shared language, private jokes, the bonds that form among people who face death together. Some of this was genuine connection, some was strategic. Alliances within the ludus could mean better treatment, protection from harassment, advance warning of danger. And Spartacus found something in this place that he had lost when he lost his freedom. Connection to another human being. The ancient sources mention her briefly, frustratingly briefly. She was Spartacus's wife, they say, though whether they were married before enslavement or formed their bond within captivity, we don't know. She was from his same tribe, some sources claim, though others suggest she was Greek. She was a follower of Dionysus, a priestess perhaps, or simply a devotee of the god of wine, madness, and ecstatic freedom. Her name is lost. The Romans who recorded history didn't think the name of a slave woman mattered enough to preserve. She exists in the sources as Spartacus's wife, defined by her relationship to him rather than by her own identity, her own story erased by history's indifference to the powerless. But she was there, and she mattered to him. In the dehumanizing environment of the ludus, where men were reduced to their capacity to kill and die entertainingly, Spartacus maintained a relationship, preserved a piece of his humanity that slavery sought to destroy. She was someone he protected, someone who gave him reason to endure beyond mere survival instinct. The sources claim she had visions, prophetic dreams that told her Spartacus was destined for greatness. One night, they say, she saw a snake coil around his face while he slept, and she knew, through whatever divine inspiration she possessed or claimed, that he would become powerful, that his name would echo through history, that his fate was extraordinary. Whether this actually happened or is legend applied retrospectively, we cannot know. But the story suggests something important. Even before the rebellion, Spartacus was different. People around him recognized qualities beyond mere fighting skill, saw leadership potential, sensed that he was capable of more than the role slavery had forced upon him. The days in the ludus blurred together. Wake to chains, train until exhausted, eat barely enough to maintain strength, sleep in cells where the air was thick with the smell of too many men confined too closely. Occasionally, the terrifying selection for games, names called, men assembled, transported to the arena to fight while crowds roared. And each time Spartacus entered the arena, he faced the calculation every gladiator faced. How to fight well enough to survive, but entertainingly enough to deserve survival. How to kill efficiently, but dramatically. How to preserve one's life by ending another's. The sand of the arena absorbed the blood of men who had made those calculations slightly wrong, had been slightly too slow, had faced opponents slightly too skilled. But through it all, Spartacus lived. Fight after fight, victory after victory, he survived when others died. He became known, developed a reputation, was possibly even popular with some segments of the crowd. A successful Thracian gladiator was valuable property, and Batiatus would have ensured he was relatively well maintained, fed properly, given decent medical attention, protected from unnecessary harm. And yet he remained a slave, remained property, remained subject to the absolute authority of Batiatus, who could decide on a whim to send him to fight impossible odds, to match him against multiple opponents, to kill him in any of 1,000 ways, for any reason or no reason at all. Success in the arena did not bring freedom, only the possibility of continued survival and the certainty of continued oppression. How long Spartacus endured this, we don't know. Months? Years? The sources are silent on the duration, but we know that eventually endurance reached its limit. The precise trigger is lost. Was it a specific cruelty, a breaking point, a final indignity that made continued submission impossible? Or was it simply that the accumulated weight of slavery, of being used and degraded and reduced to a thing, became unbearable? In 73 BCE, Spartacus and approximately 70 other gladiators decided that death in the attempt to escape was preferable to life in continued bondage. The conspiracy must have been planned carefully, though not too carefully. Too many people knowing about a plan is how plans are betrayed. 70 men is a large number for a secret, but it was also the minimum needed to have any chance of fighting through the guards. Fewer, and they would be overwhelmed. More, and someone would talk, would seek favor by revealing the plot. They could not have weapons. Gladiators trained with wooden swords and were kept away from real weapons except in the arena under close guard. But the ludus had kitchens, and kitchens had knives, meat cleavers, roasting spits, implements that could kill if wielded by men who knew how to kill. The moment came on a day we cannot date with precision. In a month the sources don't specify. 70 gladiators moved simultaneously, seizing weapons from the kitchens, turning cooking implements into tools of violence. The guards never expected organized resistance. Gladiators were slaves, broken, controlled through fear and chains, and the knowledge that resistance meant death. But Spartacus and his fellows had calculated that death was coming anyway, slowly in the arena or quickly in the attempt to escape, and they chose quickly with a chance of freedom over slowly with no chance at all. The fighting was brutal and efficient. These were men trained to kill, men who had survived the arena through skill and ruthlessness. The guards were no match for gladiators who had decided that chains were worse than death. The gladiators fought through the ludus, killed those who resisted, overwhelmed the security that was designed to contain them. Spartacus must have felt, in those moments of violence and chaos, something he had not felt since his capture. Agency. The ability to choose, to act rather than be acted upon, to determine his own fate, even if that fate was death in the next few minutes. After years of being property, of having every aspect of his existence controlled by others, he was making decisions that mattered, fighting for himself rather than for Roman entertainment. They broke free into the streets of Capua. Imagine that moment, 70 gladiators, covered in blood, armed with kitchen knives and improvised weapons, bursting into a wealthy Roman city. The chaos must have been extraordinary. Citizens fled screaming. Some brave or foolish guards attempted to stop them and died for their courage. The city was unprepared for this kind of violence, this sudden eruption of enslaved fury into orderly Roman life. And then fortune, or perhaps careful observation and planning, gave them a crucial advantage. On the streets of Capua, they encountered wagons transporting gladiatorial equipment to another ludus, real weapons, proper armor, the tools of their trade. The gladiators seized the wagons, armed themselves with actual swords and shields, and transformed from desperate escapees into a fighting force. Now they had to move. Every moment in Capua was a moment closer to organized Roman response. They fled the city, 70 men running for their lives, heading southeast toward the nearest defensible position, Mount Vesuvius, about 20 miles distant. Spartacus must have run with the knowledge that everything had changed irrevocably. There was no going back, no possibility of mercy or clemency. He had killed Roman citizens, had led a rebellion, had committed acts that Rome would punish with torture and execution. The only path forward was continued flight, continued resistance, and the hope that somehow, impossibly, they might survive. As they ran through the countryside, past fields worked by slaves who stared in amazement at armed gladiators fleeing toward the mountains, Spartacus had to be calculating. 70 men could not hold out indefinitely. They needed more fighters, needed supplies, needed a defensible position where they could rest and plan. Vesuvius offered that: difficult terrain, limited approaches, a mountain where they could see enemies approaching long before those enemies reached them. They reached the mountain as night fell, climbed into the forested slopes, and established a camp in a defensible position. Behind them, Capua was in chaos. Ahead of them, Rome's response was organizing. And around them, the night was full of possibility and terror, freedom and imminent death. Spartacus had become a rebel leader, whether he intended to or not. 70 men looked to him for decisions, for leadership, for the choices that might mean survival, or might mean they all died within days. And he must have understood, in those first hours of freedom, that leadership meant more than tactical decisions. It meant keeping these men together, focused, committed to survival, even when survival seemed impossible. They built fires, carefully controlled, positioned to be invisible from below, but sufficient to provide warmth and the psychological comfort of light in darkness. They posted guards, organized watches, ensured that Roman forces could not surprise them. And they waited to see what Rome would do. Spartacus had perhaps 70 fighters, minimal equipment, no supplies beyond what they had seized, no plan beyond immediate survival. Rome had legions, infinite resources, the entire apparatus of the Republic's military might. The disparity was absurd, the challenge impossible. And yet, sitting on that mountain, looking down at the lights of Roman farms and cities, Spartacus must have felt something that made the impossible challenge worthwhile. He was free. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since he was captured and enslaved, he made his own choices, answered to no master, lived or died, by his own decisions rather than another's whim. It would not last. He must have known that even then. Rome did not tolerate slave rebellions, did not allow property to assert humanity and independence. The legions would come. The full weight of Roman power would fall on them, and they would be crushed, because that was how these stories ended. But for now, in that moment, he was free. And he would make Rome work for his death. Rome's initial response to the Gladiator escape was exactly what Spartacus might have expected. Dismissive, contemptuous, convinced that overwhelming force would not be necessary because these were slaves, property, barely human, and certainly not capable of sustained military resistance. The Senate dispatched Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor, a high-ranking magistrate, but not a consul, not one of Rome's supreme commanders. Glaber was given approximately 3,000 men, not legionaries, but militia, a hastily assembled force that would be adequate for suppressing a slave revolt, because everyone knew that slaves, however desperate, could not stand against Roman military organization. Glaber approached Vesuvius with complete confidence. His scouts reported that the escaped gladiators, now known to number more than just the original 70, as word spread and other slaves joined them, were camped on the mountain's slopes. There was one practical path up, a trail that could be blocked and defended. Glaber positioned his forces to seal that path, preventing any escape, and settled in to wait. The strategy was sound, based on conventional military logic. The rebels had no supply lines, no sources of food beyond what they had carried or could forage from the mountain's limited resources. Within days, they would face starvation. They could attempt to fight their way through the blockade, but 3,000 armed men against a smaller force of ex-gladiators was no contest. Or they could try to scatter, to flee individually down the mountain's other sides and be hunted down piecemeal. Glaber was so confident that he did not bother with extensive fortifications or careful vigilance. His camp was positioned to block escape, but not heavily defended. Why defend against an enemy that was trapped, starving, and incapable of offensive action? On Vesuvius, Spartacus faced his first real test as a military commander. He could wait and starve, which meant certain death. He could attack down the defended path, which meant dying on Roman swords after a desperate and futile battle. Or he could find another option, something unexpected, something that used Roman assumptions against them. The slopes of Mount Vesuvius were covered with wild grapevines. They grew thick and tangled, climbing trees and cascading down cliffs, their stems as thick as a man's wrist in places. Spartacus looked at these vines and saw possibility. He ordered his men to cut the vines, to weave them into rope, to create lengths strong enough to bear a man's weight. The gladiators worked through the night, cutting, weaving, testing, creating rope from the mountain's own vegetation. It was improvisation born of desperation, a plan that depended on daring and luck, and the hope that Glaber's forces were watching only the obvious approach. The side of Vesuvius that Spartacus chose for descent was steep, not quite a cliff, but close enough that conventional military wisdom considered it impassable. Certainly impassable for a force trying to move with any speed or coordination. That assumption was what Spartacus counted on. As night deepened, with guards posted to make noise and show movement on the mountain's accessible side, giving the impression that the trapped gladiators were still huddled in their camp, Spartacus led his men to the steep face. They secured the vine ropes to trees at the cliff top, then began descending into darkness. Picture that descent. Night so dark that the ground below was invisible, only the rope in your hands and the scrape of rock against your body marking progress. Every man descending knew that a slip meant falling to death or injury, that a rope breaking meant plummeting into darkness, that discovery meant being trapped on the cliff face while Romans killed them at leisure. Spartacus must have gone first. Leaders lead, and asking men to do something you won't do yourself is no way to maintain command in desperate circumstances. He would have gripped the woven vine rope, tested his weight against it, then committed, descending hand over hand into darkness, trusting that the improvised rope would hold, that the cliff below was not sheer, that somehow this insane plan would work. And it did. One by one, the gladiators descended, 70, then more, as word had spread and other fugitive slaves had joined them in the previous days. They reached the bottom, alive, intact, undetected. They gathered in the darkness at the base of the cliff, checked weapons, organized themselves, and began moving through the night toward Glaber's camp. The Roman forces were completely unprepared for attack from outside their perimeter. Their defenses faced up the mountain toward where the gladiators were supposedly trapped. Guards watched the path, ready to prevent escape, but no one was watching the rear. Why would they? The enemy was trapped above them, contained, neutralized. When Spartacus's forces struck from behind, attacking out of the darkness, the Roman militia panicked. They were not legionaries, not professional soldiers accustomed to combat in difficult circumstances. They were citizen militia, expecting to play a supporting role in suppressing slaves, not to be attacked by desperate warriors who fought with the skill of arena survivors and the desperation of men with nothing to lose. The camp dissolved into chaos. Some Romans fought, some fled, most died or were captured before they understood what was happening. Glaber himself fled with whatever forces could disengage, abandoning the camp, the supplies, the military equipment that Spartacus's forces seized immediately. When dawn broke, Spartacus stood in a Roman military camp, surrounded by proper weapons, armor, supplies, everything a growing rebellion needed. And more importantly, he had humiliated Rome, defeated its forces through tactics that were creative, daring, and completely unexpected. But the victory meant something deeper than tactics or captured supplies. It meant that slaves could defeat Romans, that property could become persons, could assert humanity through violence that Rome understood and respected. That the impossible was possible, if only for a moment. And that moment was enough to change everything. The news of Glaber's defeat spread through southern Italy like fire through dry grass. Slaves working the great estates heard that gladiators had defeated a Roman army. Household servants whispered about warriors who had escaped bondage and won battles. Herdsmen in the mountains learned that Spartacus, the name was spreading now, attaching itself to the rebellion, had outsmarted Rome's commanders and armed his followers with captured Roman equipment. And they came. First a trickle, then a flood. Men fleeing their masters, risking everything for the possibility of freedom. They came from the latifundia, the massive agricultural estates worked by chain gangs of slaves who labored from dawn to dusk and slept in barracks that were prisons in all but name. They came from the mountain pastures, herdsmen who had spent years in isolation, tending flocks for owners who treated them slightly better than the animals they managed. They came from cities, escaping households where they were property, possessions valued for their utility. Spartacus watched his force grow from 70 gladiators to hundreds, then thousands. Within weeks, he commanded several thousand fighters. Within months, the numbers reached tens of thousands. The ancient sources vary wildly on the totals. Some claim 40,000, others 70,000. Some eventually reach the implausible figure of 120,000. But even allowing for exaggeration, the scale was extraordinary. This created problems that Spartacus had to solve immediately, or watch the entire rebellion collapse into chaos. Most of these new arrivals were not fighters. They were agricultural workers, domestic servants, people whose entire lives had been defined by labor rather than combat. They had courage. Fleeing one's master required enormous courage, but courage alone does not make soldiers. Spartacus organized training. The gladiators who formed the core of his forces became instructors, teaching basic weapons handling, simple tactical formations, the fundamentals of fighting as a unit rather than as individuals. The training was necessarily abbreviated. They did not have years to create professional soldiers, but it gave the raw recruits enough skill to be dangerous, enough coordination to function as military units. He also had to feed them. Thousands of people need food, and they need it daily. Spartacus organized raiding parties, hitting the estates that had enslaved many of his followers, seizing grain stores, livestock, everything necessary to sustain his growing army. These raids were more than practical necessity. They were psychologically powerful. Slaves were returning to the places that had held them in bondage, not as supplicants, but as conquerors, taking what they needed and destroying what they couldn't carry. The raids were not indiscriminate violence, according to most sources. Spartacus apparently maintained discipline, prevented unnecessary cruelty, tried to focus his forces' anger on the institution of slavery rather than on random destruction. This restraint was both strategic. Pointless cruelty would unite all Romans against him, and perhaps moral, suggesting that Spartacus understood the difference between fighting for freedom and simple revenge. But discipline among newly freed slaves was challenging. These were people who had suffered years of brutality, who carried rage and trauma, who had every reason to want revenge on those who had enslaved them. Keeping that rage channeled toward useful military action rather than destructive chaos required constant leadership, constant intervention, constant reminders that their goal was survival and escape, not the futile satisfaction of revenge. Two other leaders emerged during this period, Crassus and Oenomaus, both Gauls, both gladiators, who had escaped with Spartacus from Capua. They commanded their own followings, particularly among the Gallic and Germanic slaves who were flocking to the rebellion. The sources sometimes portray them as rivals to Spartacus, but the evidence suggests something more complex: a leadership council, a shared command structure that recognized the rebellion's multi-ethnic character. This was politically necessary. The rebellion was not a unified ethnic group rising against oppressors. It was a coalition of dozens of peoples: Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Syrians, Africans, Iberians, every nation that Rome had conquered and enslaved. They shared bondage as a common experience, but they were divided by language, culture, tradition, and the accumulated prejudices that even slaves carried. A single autocratic leader might have fractured this fragile coalition. Different ethnic groups might have demanded their own leaders, might have split the rebellion along tribal lines. By sharing power with Crassus and Oenomaus, by creating a leadership structure that respected different constituencies, Spartacus maintained unity. But he also maintained strategic direction, and that direction was clear. They needed to leave Italy. Spartacus understood what some of his followers did not, that Rome could not be defeated by any force they could assemble. Rome had legions stationed across the Mediterranean world. Rome had resources, infrastructure, the organizational capacity to mobilize overwhelming military power. The rebellion might win battles, might even win many battles, but it could not win a war. The only viable strategy was escape. Cross the Alps, disperse into regions beyond Roman control, return to homelands. For the Gauls, this meant Gaul. For the Germans, Germania. For Spartacus and his fellow Thracians, the long journey back to Thrace. It was not glorious, but it was survivable. Not everyone agreed with this strategy. Many wanted to remain in Italy, to continue raiding, to fight Rome directly. Some wanted revenge, to burn estates, kill masters, make Rome pay for years of brutality. Others simply did not believe escape was possible, thought that Rome would hunt them wherever they fled, and preferred to fight and die in Italy rather than flee to uncertain futures elsewhere. These disagreements remained mostly submerged during the early months of the rebellion, overshadowed by the immediate challenges of survival and the intoxication of victory. But they were there, tensions waiting to surface when circumstances forced decisions about the rebellion's ultimate direction. Rome, meanwhile, was realizing that it had a serious problem. The defeat of Gleba had been embarrassing but explicable. Militia forces, insufficient preparation, an underestimated enemy. When word reached Rome that escaped slaves had defeated a praetor's forces, the Senate's initial response was to send someone more competent with better resources. Publius Varinius was the man chosen. Another praetor, but one who took the assignment seriously, who understood that however contemptible slaves might be in social terms, they had demonstrated military capability that required professional response. Varinius assembled a more substantial force, trained soldiers rather than hastily gathered militia, commanders who understood their business, scouts who could track the slave army's movements. But Varinius faced a fundamental problem. Spartacus refused to fight on Roman terms. The conventional approach to suppressing a rebellion was to locate the enemy, bring them to battle, and destroy them in a decisive engagement. Roman military doctrine was built on the infantry clash, the grinding combat where Roman discipline and tactical superiority would eventually prevail. Spartacus avoided decisive battles. He kept his forces mobile, moving through the countryside of Campania and Lucania, raiding for supplies, picking off smaller Roman detachments, but never committing to the kind of set-piece battle where Roman numerical or organizational advantages would tell. This frustrated Verinius enormously. His forces would locate the slave army, maneuver to engage them, and arrive to find that Spartacus had moved during the night. They would set up blocking positions, only to discover that the slaves had found another route. They would divide their forces to cover more territory, and Spartacus would attack the divided detachments before they could reunite. The ancient sources describe a campaign throughout late 73 BCE where Verinius was consistently outmaneuvered. His legate Furius engaged part of Spartacus's forces and was defeated. His questor Cosinius was surprised while bathing, a humiliating detail the historians preserved with obvious delight, and barely escaped with his life, his forces scattered. Verinius himself was forced to abandon his camp when Spartacus attacked unexpectedly, losing his personal effects, including his lictors, fasces, the symbols of Roman authority. For Spartacus, these victories were not merely tactical successes, but learning experiences. Each encounter with Roman forces taught him more about how Rome made war, about Roman command structures and tactical preferences, about the gaps between Roman military theory and execution. He was essentially receiving an education in Roman warfare, paid for in Roman defeats. And with each victory, more slaves joined the rebellion. Success bred success. The impossible was becoming possible before people's eyes. Spartacus was not just surviving, he was winning. And every slave in southern Italy understood what that meant. Freedom was achievable. Rome was not invincible. The chains could be broken. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound. Slaves who had seemed docile were revealed to be potentially dangerous. Household servants who had been trusted were suddenly viewed with suspicion. How many of them were waiting for opportunity to flee to Spartacus? Agricultural workers who had seemed broken by bondage were demonstrating that they retained the capacity for organized resistance. The entire structure of Roman society, built on the assumption that slaves were controllable through fear and force, was being called into question. The wealthy landowners who dominated the Senate were suffering direct economic losses. The great estates of southern Italy were being raided or disrupted. Slaves who should have been harvesting crops were instead fighting for freedom. The latifundia that generated enormous wealth were becoming dangerous territory where overseers were killed and property was destroyed. Political pressure to end the rebellion intensified, not from humanitarian concern for the slaves, but from economic concern for the profits being lost. As 73 BCE ended and 72 BCE began, the Senate made a decision that reflected how seriously they now took the threat. The consuls, the highest elected officials of the Republic, would personally command armies against Spartacus. Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus were each given proper consular legions. Rome's actual military, might rather than hastily assembled militia forces. This was no longer a police action. This was war. But even as Rome mobilized overwhelming force, the rebellion itself was fracturing. The arguments had been building for months, submerged beneath the immediate demands of survival, but growing more intense as the rebellion's success made long-term strategy relevant. Spartacus advocated escape, move north to the Alps, cross into Gaul, disperse to homelands beyond Roman reach. It was practical, achievable, the only strategy that led to survival rather than eventual annihilation. But Crassus disagreed. Why flee when they were winning? Why abandon Italy when they controlled substantial territory? Why give up the satisfaction of making Rome pay for years of slavery? The Gauls and Germans who followed Crassus had their own calculation. They were already in Italy, which was warmer and wealthier than the lands beyond the Alps. Why return to Gaul or Germania as refugees when they could live as conquerors in Italy? The debate was not merely strategic, but reflected different understandings of what the rebellion was about. For Spartacus, it was about freedom, escaping Roman control, surviving to live as free men elsewhere. For others, it was about power, reversing the relationship between slave and master, making Romans suffer, seizing for themselves what had been denied them. Neither position was wrong exactly. Both reflected legitimate desires, understandable goals given what these men had endured. But they were incompatible strategies, and the rebellion was too fragile to pursue both simultaneously. The split occurred in early 72 BCE. Crassus and approximately 30,000 followers, primarily Gauls and Germans, though not exclusively, separated from Spartacus's main force. The ancient sources are unclear about whether this was mutual agreement or factional rupture, whether Spartacus accepted the division or fought to prevent it. What we know is the result. The rebellion divided, its forces now operating separately, with different goals and different strategies. Spartacus must have understood what this meant. Divided, they were vulnerable. United, they had defeated every Roman force sent against them. Separated, they could be defeated in detail, destroyed piecemeal, while the other force could not support them. But he could not force unity, could not command men who had chosen to follow Crassus instead. Leadership in this rebellion was voluntary. His authority came from success and respect, not from institutional power. He continued north with his remaining forces, still substantial, perhaps 40,000 people, but no longer the overwhelming numbers they had achieved at their peak. The goal remained the Alps, escape, survival. But he must have known that the rebellion's greatest strength, its size and momentum, had been compromised. Crassus led his followers south and east into the region around Mount Garganus. They raided, fought, lived as free men on Roman territory. For a time, it must have seemed like vindication of their choice. They were winning. They were free. They were making Rome acknowledge them as enemies rather than property. Then the consul Gellius arrived with his legions. The Battle of Mount Garganus was decisive and brutal. 30,000 rebels faced professional Roman legions commanded by one of Rome's highest officials. The sources provide few details of the actual fighting. Roman historians were not particularly interested in describing how they killed slaves, but they are clear about the result. Crassus's army was destroyed. 30,000 men died or were captured. Some fought to the death, refusing to surrender to return to slavery. Others attempted to flee and were hunted down by Roman cavalry. Crassus himself died in the battle, killed fighting, the sources say, which might be accurate or might be the kind of honorable death that historians assigned to worthy enemies. The captured survivors faced crucifixion, the standard Roman punishment for rebellious slaves. Death by exposure and exhaustion, hanging from crosses while the sun beat down and thirst consumed them, dying over days while birds pecked at their flesh. It was not merely execution, but demonstration. This is what happens to slaves who resist. When news of the defeat reached Spartacus, he was already moving north through central Italy. He had perhaps 40,000 followers. The path to the Alps was opening. Escape was becoming achievable. He could have continued north immediately, leaving Crassus's defeat as a tragedy, but not his own problem. Instead, he turned back. The decision reveals something crucial about Spartacus's character. Crassus had split the rebellion, had rejected his strategy, had led 30,000 followers to their deaths through stubbornness and miscalculation. Spartacus would have been justified in considering Crassus's defeat as the natural consequence of bad decisions in continuing his own march to safety. But Crassus had been a comrade, a fellow gladiator who had escaped Capua with him, who had fought beside him, who had shared command during the rebellion's early months. And the Romans who had killed Crassus were still there, confident in their victory, expecting that the slave rebellion was now broken. Spartacus sought them out deliberately. He wanted the Romans who had killed his friend to understand that the rebellion was not finished, that defeating one army didn't mean victory, that slaves could still fight and win. He found Lentulus's consular army somewhere in the region the sources call Picenum. The Romans expected an easy victory. They had just destroyed Crassus. Surely the remaining slaves would flee or submit. Instead, Spartacus gave them battle and won decisively. A consular army, commanded by one of Rome's two supreme officials, was defeated by an army of escaped slaves. Then Spartacus turned and engaged Gellius's forces, the legions that had destroyed Crassus. Again, he won. Two consular armies, Rome's best forces commanded by its highest-ranking officials, defeated in quick succession by an army that Rome still insisted on calling bandits and criminals rather than acknowledging as a legitimate military force. But victory was not merely about tactics or captured equipment. It was about honoring the dead, about demonstrating that Roman lives were not worth more than slave lives, that the gladiatorial games that had entertained Romans could be reversed. Spartacus forced 300 captured Roman soldiers to fight each other as gladiators. Picture that moment. Romans who had watched slaves die for their entertainment, who had cheered or jeered depending on the quality of the dying, now forced to experience it themselves. Fighting not for honor or glory, but for the amusement of slaves, dying to entertain people they considered property, experiencing the terror and degradation that gladiators knew intimately. It was calculated cruelty, revenge elevated to political statement. It said, "We are human beings, capable of the same violence you inflicted on us. You made us kill for your entertainment. Now you will kill for ours. You reduced us to objects. Now you will experience that objectification yourselves. The ancient historians recorded this event with obvious horror, viewing it as barbaric, proof that the slaves were savage and deserved their bondage. They seemed not to notice the irony that Romans who had institutionalized forcing slaves to fight to the death found it monstrous when slaves did the same to Romans. Spartacus may have noticed the irony. He may have intended it. Or perhaps he simply understood that some lessons are only learned through experience, that Romans who had never questioned the morality of the gladiatorial games might reconsider if they faced the arena themselves. But he did not linger for additional revenge. The gladiatorial fights honored Crassus's memory, demonstrated that Romans could be made to suffer as slaves had suffered, and then Spartacus moved on. Because revenge, however satisfying, was not the goal, escape was the goal, survival was the purpose, and every day spent in Italy was another day closer to eventual defeat. He turned north again, leading his forces toward the Alps, toward the escape that had been the plan from the beginning. Behind him, Rome was in shock. Ahead of him, the mountains rose, the boundary of the Roman world, the edge beyond which freedom might be possible. His followers marched with the confidence of men who had defeated Rome's armies repeatedly. They had captured enormous quantities of military equipment, Roman swords, Roman armor, Roman everything. They had proven themselves in battle after battle. They had demonstrated that slaves could be soldiers, that property could become persons, that the impossible was possible. The Alps were visible on the horizon. Freedom lay beyond those peaks. They were going to make it. And then something went catastrophically wrong. What happened at the foot of the Alps is one of history's great mysteries, a decision so consequential and so poorly documented that we can only speculate about its causes. The slave army reached Cisalpine Gaul, the region south of the Alps. The mountains were there, clearly visible. The passes were known. Crossing was difficult, but achievable. Spartacus had led his forces hundreds of miles through hostile territory, had defeated every Roman army sent against them, had brought tens of thousands of people to the edge of freedom. And then they turned back. Instead of crossing the Alps and dispersing to freedom, instead of executing the plan Spartacus had advocated from the beginning, the army marched back into Italy. Back toward Rome, back toward certain confrontation with the full military might of the Republic, back toward eventual annihilation. Why? The ancient sources offer explanations, none entirely satisfying. Plutarch suggests they were too confident, too convinced of their invincibility to flee when they could fight. Appian hints at disagreements among the leaders, with some wanting to march on Rome itself, while others advocated escape. Florus implies simple greed. Why leave Italy when there was more plunder to be had? None of these explanations fully accounts for such a catastrophic strategic reversal. Spartacus had demonstrated consistent strategic wisdom throughout the rebellion. He had avoided unnecessary battles, had kept his forces mobile, had always prioritized survival over glory or revenge. The decision to turn back contradicts everything we know about his leadership. The most likely explanation, though it remains speculation, is that Spartacus lost control of the strategic direction. The rebellion had grown too large, too diverse, too democratic in its structure for him to simply command obedience. The fighters who wanted to continue raiding outnumbered those who wanted to escape. The leaders who advocated remaining in Italy won the argument against the leader who understood that escape was the only viable goal. Spartacus may have been overruled, or perhaps he couldn't convince his followers to cross the Alps, couldn't make them understand that continued success in Italy was strategic failure, that every victory brought them closer to eventual defeat. Or perhaps, and this is darkest possibility, his own followers didn't trust that freedom existed beyond the mountains, feared that crossing would lead them into unknown dangers, worse than the known danger of Roman pursuit. Whatever the reason, the decision was made. The army turned south, marching back into Italy. Spartacus must have known what this meant. He was too intelligent, too experienced, too strategic to believe that they could continue defeating Roman armies indefinitely. Rome had nearly infinite resources, could field legion after legion, could absorb defeats and return with fresh forces. The slave army, however skilled, was finite. Every casualty they took could not be easily replaced. Every battle, even victories, depleted their strength. But he had made his choice, or had the choice made for him, and he would see it through. If his followers would not escape to freedom, he would lead them in continued rebellion, would give them victories as long as victories were possible, would make Rome pay dearly for every slave they killed. They marched south through Italy, back through territory they had already raided, heading toward the regions they knew. And they won another battle, defeating yet another Roman force that had thought the slave rebellion was weakening, proving again that underestimating them was fatal. But strategically, they had sealed their fate, and Rome was preparing a response that would be overwhelming. Marcus Licinius Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome. He had made his fortune through ruthless business practices, buying property during Sulla's proscriptions when political enemies were being killed and their estates sold cheaply, running a private fire brigade that would only fight fires for property owners who agreed to sell at bargain prices. He was ambitious, politically powerful, and hungry for military glory to match his wealth. The Senate granted him extraordinary authority, command of 8 legions, approximately 40 to 50,000 soldiers, plus support personnel. This was overwhelming force. Rome's military might concentrate it against the rebellion. But Crassus understood that numbers alone would not guarantee victory. Spartacus had been defeating Roman armies consistently, including consular forces. Something had to change. Crassus imposed discipline with terrifying severity. When one of his legions broke and fled before Spartacus's forces, exactly which battle this occurred in is unclear from the sources, Crassus revived an ancient punishment that had fallen out of use: decimation. The legion was divided into groups of 10 men. Each group drew lots. The man who drew the short lot was beaten to death by the other 9 members of his group. 500 men died this way, not because they personally had acted cowardly, But because the unit they belonged to had failed, the survivors had to kill their comrades, had to live with that murder, had to understand that Crassus would tolerate no failure, that fleeing from Spartacus meant death from their own commander. It was terrorism by example, leadership through fear rather than inspiration. But it worked in its brutal way. Crassus's legions understood that their commander was more frightening than the enemy. That survival required absolute obedience, that cowardice would be punished more severely than courage, that death in battle was preferable to execution by decimation. Crassus also changed tactics. Instead of seeking immediate battle, he maneuvered to control space, to limit Spartacus's mobility, to reduce the rebellion's options. He used Rome's engineering capabilities to reshape the battlefield before fighting on it, understanding that tactical skill could be countered by strategic positioning. Spartacus, meanwhile, was considering his options. Continued movement through Italy was becoming increasingly difficult. Crassus's forces were everywhere, blocking routes, controlling territory, making raiding for supplies dangerous. The Alps were no longer accessible, Crassus's legions blocking any movement north. But Sicily offered possibility. The island had been the site of massive slave rebellions in the previous century. The First and Second Servile Wars had seen hundreds of thousands of slaves rise against Rome, briefly establishing their own kingdoms before being brutally suppressed. Sicily represented both symbolic connection to previous resistance and practical opportunity. The island had its own slave population who might join the rebellion. It was separated from Italy by the narrow Strait of Messina, but much harder for Roman legions to control than the Italian mainland. If Spartacus could transport his forces to Sicily, he would have time and space to reconsider options, to rest and refit, to continue resistance without the constant pressure of Roman pursuit. At minimum, it would force Rome to conduct amphibious operations, which were complex and difficult even for Rome's military. Spartacus opened negotiations with Cilician pirates. The Cilicians controlled much of the Mediterranean's maritime traffic, were experienced in transporting human cargo. They were one of the primary sources of slaves for Roman markets, and could provide the ships necessary to move tens of thousands of people across the strait. The terms were agreed. Spartacus would pay. The sources suggest he offered captured Roman equipment, perhaps gold and silver seized in raids, and the pirates would provide transport to Sicily. Spartacus must have felt, as these negotiations concluded, that he had salvaged something from the strategic disaster of turning back from the Alps. Sicily would not be freedom in the sense of returning to homelands beyond Roman control, but it would be continued resistance, continued survival, another chance to make Rome negotiate, or at least to die, fighting on different ground. The pirates took the payment, and then they sailed away without providing the ships. Whether this was simple pirate dishonesty, taking the money and leaving the clients stranded, or whether Rome had bribed them to betray the agreement, we cannot know for certain. The sources suggest Roman involvement, implying that Crassus or other Roman officials paid the pirates more than Spartacus had, ensuring betrayal. But pirates hardly needed Roman encouragement to betray agreements, especially when keeping the payment and providing nothing was more profitable than keeping the agreement. Spartacus was trapped. Behind him, Crassus's legions were advancing. Ahead, the strait to Sicily, but no ships to cross it. To the east and west, the coasts of southern Italy, all controlled by Roman naval forces. He had no good options left, only bad options and worse ones. He fell back to the toe of Italy, to the region of Bruttium, the southernmost extension of the Italian peninsula. It was defensible terrain, difficult for large armies to move through, but it was also a trap. Limited resources, no escape routes, nowhere to go if Crassus pressed them. And Crassus was coming. The wall that Crassus built across the isthmus of Bruttium was an engineering marvel and a strategic masterstroke. It stretched approximately 40 miles from sea to sea at the peninsula's narrowest point, cutting off Spartacus's forces in the southern tip of Italy. The fortification was formidable, a ditch 15 feet deep and 15 feet wide. Behind it, an earthwork wall 15 feet high, topped with a palisade of sharpened stakes. Guard towers were erected at intervals, manned constantly, ensuring that any attempt to breach would be detected immediately. The entire construction was completed with remarkable speed. Roman legionaries were expert military engineers, capable of building extensive fortifications under field conditions. The purpose was simple: trap Spartacus's forces in Bruttium and starve them out. The region could not support 60,000 people indefinitely. The agricultural resources, the available food, the logistics of feeding a massive force, all of it depended on raiding and movement, on seizing supplies from the broader Italian countryside. Confined to Bruttium, with Crassus's wall blocking access to the rest of Italy, the slave army would face starvation within weeks. Crassus settled in to wait. He had time, supplies, the infinite resources of Rome supporting his operations. Spartacus had none of these things. Eventually, hunger would do what Roman swords had not managed: break the rebellion, reduce the slaves to weakness, create conditions where Crassus could destroy them decisively. Spartacus attempted to negotiate. The sources mention envoys sent to Crassus, discussions of terms, some kind of communication between the commanders. What exactly Spartacus proposed, we don't know. The ancient historians are frustratingly vague. Perhaps freedom in exchange for disbanding the army. Safe passage out of Italy. Some kind of negotiated end that didn't involve the annihilation of his forces. Whatever was proposed, Crassus refused. He may have demanded unconditional surrender, which Spartacus could not accept. Surrender meant slavery or execution for everyone. Or Crassus may have simply refused to negotiate at all, seeing no need to bargain with slaves when military victory was assured through patience. Spartacus was trapped behind Crassus's wall, with winter approaching and supplies dwindling. His followers were hungry, increasingly desperate, looking to him for solutions to an apparently impossible situation. He had perhaps 60,000 people dependent on his leadership, and the only path forward seemed to lead to starvation or slaughter. He studied the wall, looking for weaknesses, for opportunities, for any chance of escape. The fortifications were formidable, but they stretched 40 miles. No defensive line is perfect across such distance. Guards had to sleep sometime. Weather could provide cover. And Romans, despite their discipline, got complacent when they believed victory was assured. Spartacus waited for the right conditions. a night when weather was terrible. Winter storms, snow and wind howling across the isthmus, conditions that made guard duty miserable, that reduced visibility to nearly nothing, that gave the guards every reason to shelter rather than watch carefully. On such a night, with the wind howling and snow falling, Spartacus ordered his followers to fill a section of the ditch. They carried earth and stones, cut trees, and pushed them into the trench, threw debris and anything available into the excavation, building a causeway across the ditch and up to the wall. The work was done in darkness, in terrible weather, under conditions where discovery meant failure and death. The Romans didn't notice, or perhaps they noticed but couldn't respond effectively in the chaos of the storm. By the time the alarm was raised, Spartacus was already leading his forces across the improvised bridge, through a gap in the wall, breaking free from the trap. 1/3 of his followers made it through, approximately 20,000 people, perhaps more. They broke past Crassus's wall and scattered north, fleeing into the Italian countryside before Roman forces could react and seal the breach. But the rest, 40,000 or more, women and children and fighters who couldn't move fast enough or were too far back when the Romans responded, were trapped behind the fortifications when Crassus's legions sealed the breach. The rebellion was split, its forces divided by Crassus's wall and Roman swords. Spartacus must have experienced that escape with mixed emotions. Relief at breaking free from the trap, but horror at leaving so many behind. He had lost 2/3 of his forces, including many of the non-combatants who had been with the rebellion from the beginning. The screams behind him as the Romans attacked those who hadn't made it through, the knowledge that tens of thousands were dying or being captured while he fled. That weight must have been crushing. But he couldn't go back, couldn't save them, could only move forward with those who had escaped, and hope that speed and desperation would give them some chance of survival. He fled north with perhaps 20,000 followers, seeking any path that might lead away from Crassus, any direction that offered hope, however faint. But Rome was mobilizing overwhelming force. Pompey the Great was returning from Spain with his legions, having completed his campaign against Sertorius. Marcus Licinius Lucullus was arriving from Macedonia with his forces. The Senate was bringing multiple armies to bear, determined to end the rebellion definitively. And within Spartacus's own forces, unity was fracturing again. A large group, perhaps 12,000, the sources vary, separated from the main force. Whether this was mutiny, strategic disagreement, or simple desperation, we don't know. They were primarily Gauls and Germans, according to the sources, following their own commanders, attempting their own escape from the closing Roman trap. Crassus's legate Gnaeus Tremelius Scrofa and the questor Quintus Marcius Rufus engaged this separated force and destroyed it. 12,000 rebels died or were captured in battle. Another fraction of Spartacus's army eliminated while he could not support them. The rebellion was being dismantled, piece by piece, destroyed in detail by Roman forces that now outnumbered and outmaneuvered them. Spartacus had perhaps 20,000 followers left, exhausted from constant movement, low on supplies, running out of territory to flee into. He must have understood that escape was no longer possible, that continued flight would only lead to piecemeal destruction. his forces harried and worn down until they could resist no longer, that the only remaining choice was where to make their final stand. Better to turn and fight, to seek victory or honorable death in battle, than to die running. The final battle occurred in 71 BCE, somewhere in Lucania. The exact location is uncertain, one of many details that history has lost or never bothered to record. Spartacus prepared his forces for what he must have known would be their last fight. The sources describe him killing his horse before the battle. It was brought to him, a mount suitable for a commander, and he drew his sword and held it. His explanation, as recorded by the historians, was simple and terrible. If we win, I will have many better horses. If we lose, I will not need any horse at all. The gesture was symbolic, deliberately theatrical, designed to communicate to his followers that their commander would not flee while they fought. There would be no retreat, no escape, no survival, except through victory. Spartacus was binding himself to their fate, demonstrating that the leader shared the danger, that he would stand with them to the end. It was also, perhaps, an acknowledgement of reality. He knew they were going to lose, knew that Crassus's legions outnumbered them, that Roman discipline and equipment and organization would eventually prevail, that the rebellion's long run was ending. But he could choose how it ended, could die fighting rather than fleeing, could make Rome pay dearly for their victory. The battle began. 20,000 exhausted, desperate slaves against Roman legions, commanded by one of Rome's most determined commanders, backed by the full resources of the Republic. The outcome was never in doubt, but the manner of reaching that outcome, that Spartacus could still influence. He fought at the front, leading rather than commanding from rear. This was not how Roman generals fought. They directed from positions where they could see the battlefield, protected by bodyguards, managing the battle rather than participating directly. But Spartacus was not a Roman general. He was a gladiator who had become a rebellion leader, a man who led by example rather than by institutional authority. The sources say he sought out Crassus himself, that Spartacus fought his way through the Roman lines, killing centurions and legionaries, advancing toward where Crassus commanded, apparently hoping that killing the Roman commander might shatter the legions, or at least give his own death meaning beyond mere defeat. Picture that. A former slave, a Thracian gladiator who had terrified Rome for 2 years, cutting through Roman soldiers in a desperate attempt to reach the man who had finally trapped and destroyed his rebellion. It was futile. Crassus was well protected. The Roman lines were too deep. But it was magnificent in its futility, the kind of gesture that becomes legend precisely because it should have been impossible. He did not reach Crassus. The Roman lines held, as they always held eventually. Spartacus was wounded, multiple times the sources suggest, wounds that would have killed most men, but that he fought through on sheer determination. He continued fighting, surrounded by enemies, bleeding from a dozen places, refusing to fall while he could still hold a sword. And then he fell. How exactly, we don't know. The ancient historians say he died fighting, that he never surrendered, that he was brought down by sheer weight of numbers and wounds rather than by yielding. His body was never identified afterwards, lost among the thousands of dead, indistinguishable in death from the common soldiers he had led. Perhaps that was fitting. Spartacus had lived as one of many slaves, had died as one of many rebels. His body disappeared into the mass of the slain, no special tomb or monument, no honors beyond those his enemies grudgingly granted in their histories. He became, in death, what Rome had tried to make him in life: nameless, unremarkable, one among many. Except that he wasn't. His name survived, his story persisted, his rebellion echoed through history in ways that Roman victory could not silence. The battle ended as battles do, the Romans victorious, the rebels dead or scattered. 20,000 men had fought, most of them died. Spartacus was gone, his closest followers were killed. The slave army that had terrified Rome for 2 years was destroyed. But approximately 6,000 rebels survived the battle, fleeing north in desperate hope of escape. They ran directly into Pompey's legions, which were just arriving from Spain. Pompey destroyed this final remnant, then sent a message to the Senate claiming credit for ending the slave rebellion. This infuriated Crassus, who had done all the actual work of suppressing the revolt while Pompey arrived just in time to mop up fleeing survivors. The political rivalry between Crassus and Pompey would persist for years, eventually contributing to the First Triumvirate and the Republic's transformation into empire. But that was politics, the kind of high-level maneuvering that the dead did not care about. Crassus had the last word, delivered in a manner designed to ensure no slave ever forgot the consequences of rebellion. He crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome. 6,000 crosses lined the Appian Way for miles. They were erected at regular intervals, close enough that anyone traveling the road could see them clearly, far enough apart that each death was individual, distinct, impossible to ignore. The men were nailed or tied to the crosses. Sources vary on the method, and likely both were used depending on materials available and the mood of the executioners. Then they were left to die over the course of days, death coming from exposure, dehydration, exhaustion, and eventual respiratory failure as their body's weight made breathing progressively impossible. It was not merely execution, but demonstration. Every traveler on Rome's busiest road would see these men dying, would hear their cries, would smell their bodies as the crosses became graves. The message was explicit. This is what happens when slaves rebel. This is Rome's answer to those who seek freedom through violence. This is the fate awaiting anyone who follows Spartacus's path. Imagine being one of those 6,000. You had fought for freedom, had experienced 2 years of being a person rather than property, had defeated Roman armies and lived as a warrior rather than a slave. And now you hung from a cross, dying slowly while Romans passed below, your death designed not to end you quickly but to destroy you thoroughly, to make an example that would terrify every slave in the Republic. Some died quickly, hours rather than days, their bodies giving out from wounds sustained in battle or from the shock of crucifixion. Others lingered for days, their deaths dragged out by physical fitness, by the body's stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender was mercy. The crosses became stages for prolonged dying, each one a demonstration of Roman power and Roman cruelty. The rebels had families, friends, comrades who were not captured. Imagine being a survivor of the rebellion, having escaped somehow, and walking the Appian Way to see your brothers, your friends, your leaders hanging from crosses. The psychological impact must have been devastating. Not merely grief for the dead, but the crushing knowledge that Rome could do this, would do this, had done this, and would do it again to anyone who resisted. Crassus left the bodies on the crosses until they rotted. Weeks, possibly months, the dead hanging above Rome's most important road. It was excessive even by Roman standards of brutality, a demonstration that seemed designed less to prevent future rebellion than to satisfy something darker in the Roman psyche. A need to thoroughly destroy not merely the rebels, but the very idea of rebellion. The crucifixions were the physical end of the rebellion, but they could not crucify the memory, could not nail the story to a cross and leave it to rot. The tale of Spartacus persisted, despite Rome's best efforts, to reduce it to a cautionary tale of justified punishment. The gladiator who escaped bondage, who defeated Rome's armies repeatedly, who came impossibly close to achieving the impossible. That story was too powerful to contain, too meaningful to suppress. It lived in the whispers of slaves who heard about it second-hand, in the nightmares of masters who realized their property might resist, in the calculations of Roman politicians who understood that military victory had not addressed the fundamental contradictions slavery created. The years following the rebellion saw some changes in Roman slavery practices, though less than one might hope. The security around gladiatorial schools was increased. Batiatus's ludus had been too casual in its confinement, too confident that slaves would not organize resistance. New protocols were developed, more guards hired, the conditions of confinement made more severe. The treatment of gladiators became marginally less brutal, not from humanitarian concern, but from practical recognition that training men to be warriors and then treating them with absolute cruelty created dangerous enemies. The business model was refined, still exploitative, still built on human suffering, but slightly more careful about pushing men to the point where death in rebellion seemed preferable to continued existence. But the fundamental institution of slavery remained unchanged. Rome's economy still depended on enslaved labor. The great estates still operated with chain gangs. The mines still worked slaves to death and replaced them with fresh captures. The household servants still lived at the mercy of masters who owned them as completely as they owned furniture. Spartacus had not changed Rome's social structure. He had merely revealed its vulnerabilities, demonstrated that the system's foundations were less stable than Romans preferred to believe. In the immediate aftermath, there was paranoia. Every slave was potentially a rebel, every group of slaves a possible conspiracy. Masters who had been casual in their dominance became more cautious, more vigilant, more ready to interpret any deviation from perfect submission as potential revolt. The fear was not entirely irrational. Spartacus had proven that slaves could organize, could fight, could win battles against Rome's military forces. But fear is exhausting to maintain, and eventually the paranoia faded. Within a generation, Spartacus became history rather than immediate threat. The crucified bodies were eventually taken down from the Appian Way, the bones disposed of, the crosses removed. Life continued. Slavery continued. Rome continued. Yet something had shifted in the collective consciousness. The absolute certainty that slaves were naturally inferior, that bondage was their proper state, that they lacked the capacity for organized resistance. All of this had been disproven definitively. Romans could no longer quite believe their own justifications with the same unquestioning confidence. The philosophers and historians who wrote about Spartacus struggled with this cognitive dissonance. They described him in terms usually reserved for Roman heroes: brave, honorable, strategic, a natural leader. Plutarch explicitly stated that Spartacus displayed more culture and intelligence than his circumstances would suggest, essentially admitting that a Thracian slave had demonstrated greater virtue than many Roman commanders. But they had to condemn the rebellion itself, had to insist that Rome's suppression of it was righteous and necessary, had to maintain that slavery was justified, even while acknowledging that this particular slave had been extraordinary. The contradictions in their accounts reveal their discomfort. They admired Spartacus even while affirming the system that had enslaved him. The story took on different meanings for different audiences. Among the Roman elite, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating slaves too harshly, about the need to maintain careful control, about the military threats that could emerge from social contradictions. It was studied tactically. How had Spartacus defeated so many Roman commanders? What could be learned from his strategies? Among Rome's slaves and poor, the story meant something else entirely. It became legend, proof that resistance was possible, that the powerful were not invincible, that courage and determination could challenge even Rome's military might. The details were probably distorted through retelling. Spartacus became more heroic, his victories more glorious, his cause more noble than the messy reality of a rebellion driven by desperation and survival instinct. But distorted or not, the legend served a purpose. It gave hope to people who had little reason for hope. It suggested that their condition wasn't natural or inevitable, but imposed, and that imposed conditions could be resisted. It created a narrative where slaves were protagonists rather than background characters in Roman stories. Spartacus himself would never know any of this. He died on a battlefield in Lucania, his body lost among thousands of others, his death probably quick compared to those who were crucified afterwards. Whatever he thought about in his final moments, regret for decisions made, grief for followers he had led to death, satisfaction that he had fought rather than submitted, died with him. He had wanted to escape. That was his goal from the beginning, not to conquer Rome or overthrow slavery as an institution or establish a new social order. He wanted to survive, to get his followers out of Italy, to return to Thrace, or help the Gauls return to Gaul, or simply exist somewhere beyond Roman control. The grand revolutionary rhetoric that later ages would attach to his rebellion was probably not his own. He was a pragmatist trying to survive, not an ideologue trying to transform society. And he nearly succeeded. Had his followers crossed the Alps when they had the chance, had the pirates not betrayed him, had various tactical and strategic decisions fallen differently, escape might have been possible. The margin between success and failure was narrow, determined by factors Spartacus could not fully control despite his capabilities. But he failed. The rebellion was crushed, his followers were killed or enslaved again, and Rome continued largely unchanged. From one perspective, his entire effort was futile. 2 years of fighting, tens of thousands of deaths, nothing permanently altered except perhaps Roman vigilance against slave rebellion. From another perspective, he achieved something more valuable than tactical success. He demonstrated that slaves were human beings, capable of everything Rome claimed as distinctly Roman virtues: courage, leadership, strategic thinking, loyalty, honor. He forced Rome to acknowledge, even if only implicitly, that the institution of slavery required violence to maintain, because slaves, given opportunity, would resist. And he created a legend that would outlive Rome itself. The Roman Republic did not long survive Spartacus's rebellion. The political dynamics that the rebellion revealed or exacerbated, the power of military commanders, the weakness of traditional institutions, the rivalry between ambitious men like Crassus and Pompey, would eventually destroy the Republic and birth the Empire. Crassus parlayed his military success against Spartacus into political power, becoming part of the first triumvirate alongside Pompey and Julius Caesar. His hunger for military glory matching his wealth would eventually lead him to disaster in Parthia, where he died in 53 BCE, his legions destroyed and his head allegedly filled with molten gold by enemies who understood his obsession with wealth. Pompey continued his rise to prominence, though his claim to have ended the Spartacus rebellion was always overshadowed by the fact that Crassus had done the actual work. His rivalry with Caesar would lead to civil war, and his death on an Egyptian beach in 48 BCE, murdered by those he sought as allies. Caesar's rise to dictatorship, his assassination, the civil wars that followed, and the eventual establishment of the empire under Augustus, all of this occurred within living memory of Spartacus's rebellion. The Rome that Spartacus had challenged was dying, transforming into something different, and while his rebellion was not the direct cause of that transformation, it was symptomatic of the Republic's fundamental instabilities. The empire that replaced the Republic maintained slavery, of course. The institution was too economically important, too deeply embedded in social structure, too convenient for those in power to abandon. But the empire also developed more sophisticated methods of control, more careful management of the slave population, more awareness that pushed too far. Humans will resist regardless of their legal status. And the story of Spartacus persisted through the empire's long centuries. When Rome fell and the ancient world gave way to medieval Europe, when Christianity transformed civilization and slavery took new forms, the story survived. Not always accurately. Legends accumulated, details were lost, fiction blended with history. But the essential narrative remained: a slave who refused his bondage, who fought for freedom, who nearly succeeded against impossible odds. The medieval period knew Spartacus primarily through fragmentary references in Roman histories. He was a minor figure in larger narratives, mentioned as the leader of a slave revolt that Rome had righteously suppressed. The details were scarce, the story simplified, but it was remembered. The Renaissance rediscovered classical texts, and with them, fuller accounts of the rebellion. Humanist scholars read Plutarch and Appian, encountered the more detailed narratives of Spartacus's campaigns, and began to see him differently. Not merely as a rebel slave, but as a tragic hero, a man elevated by circumstances to greatness he never sought but bore with honor. The Enlightenment era, with its emphasis on natural rights and human dignity, found in Spartacus a powerful symbol. Here was someone who asserted human value against a system that denied it, who fought for freedom when freedom was considered inappropriate for his class. Enlightenment thinkers could point to Spartacus as evidence that the capacity for liberty existed in all humans, regardless of their social position. The Age of Revolution, American, French, Haitian, invoked Spartacus repeatedly. Revolutionary movements found in his story validation for their own struggles against oppression. The Haitian Revolution particularly echoed Spartacus's rebellion, enslaved people rising against their masters, fighting for freedom against overwhelming odds, ultimately succeeding where Spartacus had failed by establishing an independent nation. The 19th century saw Spartacus appropriated by emerging socialist and communist movements. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels saw him as an early proletarian revolutionary, a man who led the oppressed masses against the ruling class. The rebellion became, in their interpretation, an early chapter in the eternal class struggle, proof that workers throughout history had resisted exploitation. This Marxist interpretation would prove remarkably influential. When the Soviet Union emerged from the Russian Revolution, it named organizations after Spartacus. Spartak Moscow, the sports club, carries his name to this day. Communist parties worldwide invoked his memory, seeing themselves as heirs to his struggle against oppression. The 20th century brought Spartacus to mass audiences through cinema. The 1960 film, starring Kirk Douglas and directed by Stanley Kubrick, became one of the great Hollywood epics. It took enormous liberties with history, inventing romances, creating dialogue, imposing modern sensibilities on ancient events. But it captured something essential about the story: the dignity of fighting for freedom, the nobility of resistance to injustice, the tragedy of courage that falls just short of success. The scene where captured rebels are offered clemency if they identify Spartacus, and each man rises to declare, "I am Spartacus." This never happened, has no basis in ancient sources, is pure Hollywood invention. But it became one of cinema's most iconic moments, precisely because it expressed a truth deeper than historical fact: that Spartacus represented something larger than an individual, that his rebellion was about collective humanity, asserting its dignity against dehumanization. The film also became political in ways beyond its content. It was written by Dalton Trumbo, one of the Hollywood 10 blacklisted during the McCarthy era for alleged communist sympathies. Kirk Douglas insisted on crediting Trumbo openly, effectively breaking the blacklist. A film about slaves fighting oppression became a weapon against political oppression, Spartacus's story deployed against modern injustice. More recently, the television series Spartacus took a different approach, emphasizing the violence and complexity of the ancient world, the brutality of gladiatorial combat, the moral ambiguities of rebellion. It was more graphic, less idealistic, more willing to show that even righteous resistance involves terrible violence and moral compromise. But it, too, was fundamentally about human beings refusing to accept their reduction to property, fighting for recognition of their humanity. These cultural representations, films, novels, television series, political invocations, are all historically questionable in various ways. They impose modern values on ancient events, create motivations and dialogue that ancient sources don't support, simplify complex realities into dramatic narratives. But they testify to something important. The story of Spartacus remains meaningful, continues to resonate, still speaks to fundamental human concerns about freedom, dignity, and resistance to oppression. What can we finally say about Spartacus himself, the man beneath 2,000 years of legend and interpretation? We know frustratingly little with certainty. His childhood is lost to history. His early life exists only in speculation. Even his appearance is unknown. No contemporary descriptions survive, and the later artistic representations show what artists imagined rather than what he actually looked like. What we have are his actions, and from those actions we can infer character. He demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking, tactical creativity, and military leadership. His escape from Vesuvius using vine ropes showed improvisation under pressure. His repeated defeats of Roman armies showed that he understood warfare at a sophisticated level. His advocacy for escape over conquest showed strategic wisdom, recognition that some victories are strategic defeats. He showed unusual restraint for someone in his position. The sources emphasize that he prevented unnecessary cruelty, maintained discipline, tried to focus violence on military targets rather than indiscriminate destruction. This restraint was both strategic, pointless cruelty would have united all Romans against him, and perhaps ethical, suggesting someone who understood the difference between fighting for freedom and simple revenge. He shared power with other leaders rather than demanding sole authority. This political sophistication maintained unity among diverse peoples when dictatorial leadership might have fractured the rebellion. He led by example, fighting at the front rather than commanding from safety, demonstrating that his authority came from effectiveness rather than mere position. And he failed, ultimately, to save most of his followers. The rebellion ended in annihilation, with tens of thousands dead and 6,000 crucified. By any practical measure, his revolt was a disaster, temporary disruption followed by savage suppression that probably made conditions worse for slaves throughout the Republic. But he demonstrated something that could not be crucified away: that slaves were fully human, capable of everything Romans claimed as their exclusive virtues; that the institution of slavery required constant violence because slaves, given any opportunity, would resist. That freedom was not a status granted by social position, but a capacity inherent in human beings, something that could be suppressed but not eliminated. His motivation, why he did what he did, remains speculative. Was he idealistic, fighting for philosophical principles about human dignity? Or was he pragmatic, simply seeking survival for himself and those who followed him? Did he care deeply about the masses who joined his rebellion, or were they tools for his own purposes? The evidence suggests pragmatism more than ideology. He wanted to escape, to survive, to get out of Italy before Roman power crushed them. He made tactical decisions aimed at preserving his forces rather than seeking glorious but futile victories. He tried to prevent his followers from pursuing revenge when revenge would jeopardize survival. These are not the actions of an ideologue, but of someone focused on practical outcomes. Yet his pragmatism served deeply human purposes. He wanted freedom, for himself certainly, but he worked to achieve it for tens of thousands of others. He could have fled alone, or with a small group after escaping the ludus, could have sought individual survival. Instead, he took responsibility for a growing army of desperate people, led them as long as leadership mattered, and died fighting beside them when leadership could no longer save them. The ancient historians, writing from Rome's perspective, called him a slave and a bandit. But they also, almost despite themselves, described him as honorable, brave, intelligent, a natural leader. They condemned his rebellion as criminal while describing his conduct in terms that honored him. The contradictions in their accounts reveal their discomfort with a reality that challenged their assumptions. A slave had demonstrated all the virtues Rome claimed as distinctly Roman. Modern interpretations have been equally contradictory, seeing in Spartacus whatever the interpreter wanted to find. Revolutionaries saw a proto-revolutionary. Socialists saw class consciousness. Liberals saw human rights advocacy. Conservatives, uncomfortable with celebrating rebellion, emphasized his tragic nobility. Admirable in defeat, his resistance noble precisely because it failed, and thus threatened nothing. The truth, as usual, is probably simpler and more human than any of these grand interpretations. Spartacus was a man who became property, who decided that freedom was worth dying for, who had the capability to lead others in that pursuit, and who very nearly succeeded against impossible odds. He was not perfect. He made strategic errors, lost control of his followers at crucial moments, could not prevent the rebellion's ultimate defeat. But he fought with skill and courage for something that mattered, and he created a story that has inspired resistance to oppression for 2 millennia. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the specific details of his life matter less than what his life demonstrated. That human beings will resist dehumanization. That freedom is something people will fight for, even when fighting seems futile. That courage and leadership can emerge from the most oppressed circumstances, and that sometimes the greatest victories are achieved in defeat, not tactically, but in creating memories that outlast empires. Rome crucified 6,000 of Spartacus's followers along the Appian Way, creating a demonstration of power designed to terrify anyone who might consider rebellion. But they could not crucify the story, could not nail the memory to a cross and leave it to rot. The tale of a slave who fought for freedom survived Rome itself, outlived the empire that tried to reduce it to a cautionary tale, and became something Rome never intended: inspiration for every subsequent struggle against oppression. Spartacus wanted to escape to freedom beyond Rome's reach. He failed, died on a battlefield in Lucania, his body lost among the thousands of slain, his goal of returning to Thrace unachieved. But in failing, he achieved a different kind of escape. He escaped the confines of his time, transcended his specific historical moment, and became eternal. Not as a god or a saint, but as a human being who insisted on his humanity when the world's greatest power tried to deny it. 2,000 years later, his name still echoes. The gladiator who became a general, the slave who terrorized Rome, the man who nearly achieved the impossible. The specific details of his life are mostly lost. His childhood, his appearance, his inner thoughts, all erased by history's indifference. But his essential story persists. He was a human being treated as property, and he refused to accept that treatment. He fought for freedom with everything he had, and though he lost the battle, the war continues in his name. That is perhaps the final truth about Spartacus. He did not change Rome, did not overthrow slavery, did not achieve his strategic objectives. But he changed the story. He demonstrated that slaves were not passive victims, but potential warriors, that oppression required constant violence because people would resist given opportunity, that human dignity was not something granted by social position, but something inherent, inalienable, and worth dying to defend. Rome crucified 6,000 to ensure that message was forgotten. 2,000 years of history have proven that crucifixion, however brutal, cannot kill ideas, cannot nail human dignity to a cross and watch it die, cannot destroy the memory of someone who insisted, against all evidence, that freedom mattered more than survival. Spartacus died in 71 BCE on a battlefield whose exact location we no longer know. But somewhere in Lucania, somewhere in southern Italy, a Thracian gladiator made his final stand. He fought for freedom, his own and others, with skill and courage that Rome itself was forced to acknowledge. He lost, as the sources always suggested he would. Rome was too powerful, too organized, too ruthless for any slave rebellion to permanently succeed. But in losing, he won something more valuable than tactical victory. He won a place in human memory, a story that would inspire resistance for millennia, a demonstration that sometimes the most important thing is not whether you win or lose, but whether you fight for something worth fighting for. The crosses along the Appian Way eventually rotted and fell. The bodies were disposed of, the road was cleared, Rome continued. But the story survived because stories are more powerful than crosses, because memory is more enduring than punishment, because the human need for freedom cannot be crucified away, no matter how many examples are made. Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. We have explored the story of Spartacus, from his unknown childhood in Thrace to his enslavement and gladiatorial servitude, from his desperate escape to his stunning victories, from his strategic wisdom to his tragic defeat, from his death on a battlefield to his immortality in human memory. The journey has shown us that the powerless can become powerful, that property can become persons, that the impossible sometimes becomes possible through courage and leadership and desperate determination. The story of Spartacus is not primarily about ancient Rome or military tactics or the specific details of his campaigns. It is about something more fundamental: the human refusal to accept dehumanization, the insistence that freedom matters, the willingness to fight for dignity even when fighting seems futile. That message has echoed across 2,000 years, inspiring everyone from Caribbean slaves fighting for freedom to blacklisted screenwriters fighting censorship. It persists because it addresses something universal: the human need for agency, for dignity, for the right to determine one's own fate rather than exist as someone else's property. Spartacus failed to escape Italy, failed to save his followers, failed in almost every practical objective. But he succeeded in demonstrating that slaves were human beings, that the oppressed could resist, that freedom was worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. And that success, though intangible, has proven more enduring than Rome itself. Sweet dreams.